from the definition of first responder law enforcement officer, as well as law enforcement agencies. And this would, removing law enforcement from this section would exempt those agencies from the requirements of subsection F, which would require that first responder agency to have a medical director who's a physician, as well as certain supply and training requirements. Current law states that, or additionally, language would be added that in section G4, that any law enforcement officer who in good faith and with reasonable care administers an emergency opioid antagonist to a person experiencing a suspected overdose would be exempt from criminal and civil liability. I'll be happy to answer questions.
Great, Jenna, thank you so much. Committee, are there any questions for Jenna? Please raise your hand. Kenyon, do we have any hands raised?
No.
All right, seeing none, we will move to our oral proponent. Is Ed Klump on with us?
I am, Madam Chair.
Great, thank you, Ed. Your face is a little smeary on my screen, but we can still hear you. Please go ahead.
All right. Hopefully my voice won't be smeary.
No, your voice is fine.
Okay. I'm Ed Klump, and I am representing today the Kansas Association of Chiefs of Police, Kansas Sheriff's Association, the Kansas Peace Officers Association. We requested this bill to address kind of an issue created by this statute that was very necessary in its inception, and now it's not so necessary. So this has to do with the use of Narcan or the naloxone, or what's officially called the opioid antagonist. And so when this statute was created, those drugs were by prescription only, and there was a need to get them out in the hands of first responders so that we could administer them in the field. And in order to do that, we had to have all these parameters set. We worked with the Board of Pharmacy in establishing these. Actually, the Board of Pharmacy initiated the discussions on that. And so now that these drugs do not require prescription, they're kind of a burden on us in some areas for law enforcement. I'll tell you, I did speak with some people from EMS and fire, and they did not want to be included in the bill. That's why they're not included. It's just law enforcement. So the intent here is to expand the number of agencies that are willing to distribute the naloxone to their employees, their officers out in the field to carry. The primary obstacle to that right now for our small agencies is subsection F, which requires us to have a medical advisor. And in some of our small agencies, that's a financial challenge, and it's also a challenge in some of our rural areas finding a physician that's willing to take that on. Now that a prescription is not required to acquire this, it's just not necessary that we do that. So that's the essence of what we're trying to accomplish in this bill. I won't go through it step by step. Jen has already explained it, and I've got an explanation in my testimony there. I will tell you, I'm working with Jenna on potentially a amendment to this. I think there's a easier way to do this that probably is a better way, and we're working on that and hope to have that to the committee very soon, so you can work the bill and consider that amendment. And with that, Madam Chair, I'll stand for questions.
Thank you, Ed. Committee, are there any questions for Ed Klump? And Kenyon, if you can tell me if you see any questions from the committee.
Okay, no hands are up right now.
All right, thank you. Ed, I do have a question for you, or just a comment. I do plan to work Senate Bill 193 tomorrow at committee, assuming we'll be in the Capitol. If we're not and we're on WebEx, we've been given permission to take final action on bills. So if you can get that amendment to Jenna right away. As you know, we're in a very abbreviated session here So we would need to get that right away, okay?
Right. It is in Jenna's hands right now. We've
Good.
talked about it yesterday. We just need to work out, I think, some details in it.
That sounds great. All right, committee, this closes the hearing on Senate Bill 193, and we will open the hearing on Senate Bill 145. And Kenyon, can you give me an update as to how many of our members are on, or Jenna, if you can tell me how many of our members are on WebEx?
I don't know who exactly is on the committee, but it's up to participants in the WebEx now.
Senator Gossage, you have 9 people.
9. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. So this opens the hearing on Senate Bill 145, as I said, and Jenna, would you begin with the bill brief?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Senate Bill 145 requires immediate notification of a report of abuse or neglect to a law enforcement agency and provides for a law enforcement agency to request resources from the Secretary of Children and Families. This bill would amend KSA 382226, which is in the revised Kansas Code for Care of Children. This is the section of law that deals with children in need of care. And it amends in subsection B under the joint investigation section, that when assigned by the secretary for an investigation, the secretary shall immediately notify law enforcement agency with jurisdiction of the location of alleged abuse or neglect or the residence of a child who is the subject of the report, so that law enforcement agency can investigate whether a crime has occurred. This would also add language to the end of the subsection B. Upon request of an investigating law enforcement agency, the secretary shall share resources related to investigating reports of abuse or neglect to facilitate a joint investigation or an investigation of a potential crime being conducted by such law enforcement agency. And you may see other italics in this bill draft, and those are just headings. It's not new language, so it can be a little bit confusing. But if it's right after a subsection CDE and there's a period after it, that just means it's a heading, not that it is new language. So hopefully that makes sense. I'll be happy to answer questions.
Committee, are there any questions of Jenna?
Madam Chair, Adam Thomas here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Please go ahead, Senator Thomas.
Jenna, what is out of curiosity the current process if abuse or neglect is requested or this process?
Jenna,
Thank you, Madam Chair.
you may answer.
That may be a better question for one of the proponents who deals a little bit more with this, the internal processes.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Now we will move to
You have Senator Petty with her hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry, Senator Petty.
Yes, and this, Jenna, I think you answered this. I just wanted to make sure. So you said that those italics, like on page 2, line 17, that those are just headings. Those are not new language.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sorry, yes. Yep, so that would be what lines 8, 17, 21, 25, 28. Those are all just headings.
And then my second question is, does this amendment to current law, does this mean that they have to jointly go to investigation, or it says all investigations and reports shall include the date, time, and location of any visual, that's about the visual observation. So do both of them, this is on page 3, do both law enforcement and the secretary, do they have to show that they have observed this child?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So that is current law, and that requirement of visual observation would be to the secretary or the law enforcement agency or the agency's designee. And so not both, but you would have an either or. They both could, but they would not be required to, just one.
Okay, thank you.
Additional questions for Jenna Committee? All right, not seeing or hearing any questions, we'll move to our oral neutral Ed Klump.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ed Klump, again, for the Kansas Association of Chiefs of Police, Kansas Sheriff's Association, Kansas Peace Officers Association. We're providing neutral testimony here because we don't oppose the intentions, the concept of the bill, but we do oppose the current language in that we believe it has the potential to capture cases that do not need to come from law enforcement or to law enforcement, and it would be a significant caseload for us to have to sift through those that have already been sorted out by DCF. So in the middle of my testimony, you see some suggested amendments there. I'll tell you right off the bat, I have not spoken to Jenna about these yet. So it needs some of the reviser's magic sprinkle put on it yet. But the language in number 1 would narrow that down to any time they receive a complaint like this and they're assigning it to one of their investigators and they believe that a crime has occurred, then we want to know about those right away so we can get on those cases quickly. And I think this language.
Ed, we lost you. We're not hearing you now. There we go.
Somehow I got muted. I'm not sure
Okay.
how. So I'm not sure where you lost me at.
Just the maybe last sentence.
Okay, so we think that this amendment would clarify that better, that we'll get those cases that law enforcement needs and should be involved in investigating because a crime is occurring, or of course if there's an immediate need for law enforcement presence to make sure the child is safe. And the second one has to do with the sharing of information. And just to be clear of what information we're sharing back and forth between each other in these cases, we would like to see an addition probably on page 2, lines 4 to 7 after that language there, that any information relevant to the case possessed by the Department of Children and Families or by the investigating law enforcement agency shall be promptly exchanged as provided in those 4 statutes listed there. And those are statutes you may remember we worked on a couple of years ago to clarify what information was being shared and that it was pretty much all the information that would be important for both agencies to know as they jointly investigate these cases. And with that, Madam Chair, I'll stand for questions.
Committee, any questions for Ed? And I will tell you, we had this discussion, Ed, and one of these amendments I have shared with Jenna, so she should have that as we discussed.
Okay.
Are there any questions for Ed? I see Pat Petty has her hand up. Senator Petty?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So Ed, you mentioned, I'm assuming a question about and 32, changing that language, as well as on page 2, which would if the language on the page 1 is impacted, that does impact where you talked about making making an amendment on page 2, because now only those cases that excuse me, where it did say shall immediately notify the law enforcement agency within the jurisdiction, you're saying it would occur when there was evidence of a
I don't I don't believe the amendment would do that. I think it's still an immediate notification. It's just that immediate notification wouldn't be made on cases that didn't either involve, I believe that crime occurred or the need for immediate presence to protect the child. So we're just suggesting adding some language at the very beginning.
Okay, I'll be interested in seeing that because this seems to imply that anytime they get, have to do an investigation, you would have to be notified.
Well, I think it's that way in the current language, and I mean we'll work with Jenna to make sure we get what we intend there, but I think this does it because then it would read when there is reason to believe a crime has occurred and upon assignment by the Secretary for Investigation, and we suggest to clarify that it's a Department of Children and Families investigation, shall immediately notify the law enforcement agency with jurisdiction of the location of where the alleged abuse or neglect occurred. So I think that gets us to where we're intending, but I don't know if Jenna wants to chime in now on that, whether she has looked at that close.
I'll listen for the rest of the testimony. Thank you.
Go ahead, Jenna.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I will work with Jesse in our office who does more of these children and seniors issues on the House to get that language worked out.
Great. Thank you so much. Committee, any additional questions for Ed?
Madam Chair, Adam Thomas here. I have a question.
Yes.
So Ed, talk to me about what the current process is, because I guess I just sort of thought that this was already in place. So I read this bill and I'm supportive of the idea. I'm just a little confused as far as when abuse is reported right now. Is it just DCF involved and there's current levels where they get law enforcement involved, and we're just making it a little more law enforcement involvement, or just kind of help me understand kind of where we're at if without this bill.
And Senator Thomas, too, we do have Tanya Keys who will be speaking from DCF's point of view, but please go ahead.
Okay,
Ed.
perfect.
Ed, did you want to respond?
Well, I'll respond on the law enforcement side. When law enforcement discovers a case of abuse or neglect, we're a mandatory reporter, so we report that to DCF as well. And when DCF gets reports, they have a screening process that I'll let them talk about. And then when a case is assigned to one of them for investigation, abuse cases, I think we're always notified pretty quickly on, but I'm not certain of that. I think this statute kind of clarifies that would be the case. Neglect investigations, I think is kind of different. But I when we get them, we get on these cases as quickly as we can and start an investigation to see if there's either a criminal activity we need to investigate or do we need to take some immediate action to protect the child. And then neglect cases pretty much go back then to DCF for their action on it.
Okay, thank you, Ed. Thank you, Senator Thomas. Are there any other questions for Ed Klump before we move to our next conferee? All right, seeing none, we will move to Carrie Leonard, our Kansas Child Advocate. There you are,
Good morning,
Carrie. Go
Madam
ahead.
Chair, members of the
Good
committee.
morning.
Good morning. Hopefully you can hear me okay.
Yes.
I appreciate the opportunity to testify this morning as a neutral for Senate Bill 145. The Office of the Child Advocate has received a number of complaints truly regarding the communication pathways between both DCF and law enforcement. And any efforts to improve those communication pathways, we strongly support to ensure child safety and best support our families in the communities. One of the concerns that we have is just the volume of concerns that we know both law enforcement and DCF are already receiving. And we want to make sure that the intention behind this bill does not lead us to unintentional administrative burden on the two agencies, then slowing the processes down. So a lot of the suggestions in my testimony in many ways mirror, I think, what Ed Klump was just suggesting as well, around clarifying that not every single assigned case would automatically be referred in order to reduce, hopefully, that administrative burden and then potentially slowing the communication between both law enforcement and DCF. In addition, our office has made a number of recommendations, and it goes a step further, and a lot of it is specifically as to the policies within DCF. However, I thought it was important to share with the committee this morning as we're thinking about how those communications occur, so that if there is additional language that would be beneficial in as this bill is being worked, to ensure that there's timely communication that is happening when there is a joint investigation occurring. So one of the concerns that we have is making sure that it's identified who then is the primary investigative agency, whether it's going to be law enforcement or DCF, and then how that communication is going to occur on a regular basis. So we would recommend, whether it be through this bill, another bill, or that the two agencies work together to clarify their own policies and practices. And Madam Chair, I believe that concludes our position on Senate Bill 145, and I'd be happy to stand for questions.
Very good. Thank you. Committee, any questions for Carrie? All right, seeing none, thank you, Carrie. And we will move to Tanya Keys.
I'm sorry,
Senator
Senator Gossage. Senator
Yes.
Holscher has her hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see that hand raised. I guess I'm not seeing everything on my end. Senator Holscher, did you have a question for Carrie?
I do, thank you. My
Mhm.
question is in regard to, and maybe Ed touched upon this a little bit and you did as well, Gary. Is there something to be said in terms of volume of cases? And I'm with you too, that the communication is important and the timing is important in terms of that information being relayed. But I'm also wondering too, of those reported cases or information that comes in, I mean, are there a certain number of them that maybe aren't abuse or neglect? Then are we overloading law enforcement and causing them to do additional work when maybe, information hasn't been substantiated? So I'm just thinking of volume. Did that make sense?
Carrie, would you like to respond?
Thank you, Madam Chair and Senator. Yes. So the current proposed language, basically, my understanding of it says that upon assignment by the Secretary for an investigation, the Secretary shall immediately notify law enforcement agency where there is alleged abuse or neglect if it's assigned. So that includes every single case that's been assigned by, if I'm reading it correctly, every single case that's been assigned by DCF for both abuse and neglect. And I think that increases the number of reports that are already going to law enforcement with that additional language, specifically in regards to those neglect cases. And so I'm concerned about that administrative burden of kind of figuring out which cases require immediate assistance and more intensive investigation. I'm also concerned about potentially the impact on family engagement if we have both DCF and law enforcement responding to every single case that's been assigned. I am concerned that we're going to see a decrease in families' willingness to work and engage with services in order to ensure the protection and safety of children in their homes.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And Ed, if you're still there, could you come back on to the mic for just a moment?
I am.
Because I don't know that I actually heard you say on that the reason, because as you had shared with me, there was some 72,000 cases and 32,000 that would be abuse potentially. So the amendment would say on line 31 that you shared with me is if there is reason to believe a crime has been occurred. So that you wouldn't get all of these cases. Is that accurate?
Yes, the reason for our amendment request, that number 1 amendment, is to address exactly what Senator Petty was talking about. We don't need cases, even if DCF is investigating them, primarily of neglect, because some of those will not involve a level of neglect that's criminal. And but we do want to be sure we get them when they believe there is criminal activity going on. And that's what our amendment is trying to do, is narrow that number of cases that really are truly DCF cases and don't need to involve us, versus the one where we do need to get involved. You know, DCF doesn't have the authority to do a criminal investigation. So that's why law enforcement needs to be involved in those where we believe a crime may have occurred. And I think this amendment addresses what Senator Petty was talking about.
And Senator Holscher, I believe. So I think if we move forward to
Yes.
Tanya Keys's, yes, that's okay. If we move forward to Tanya Keys's testimony, this may give us a little bit of underlying understanding. Thank you, Ed. Tanya, we're ready for you. Tanya Keys.
Thank you, Chair Gossage and members of the committee. Can you hear me okay this morning?
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to also provide neutral testimony. You heard from Jenna the 3 and others, the 3 primary changes for this. So I'll go through. The first, there's language, as you've heard, that requires the secretary to immediately notify law enforcement for joint investigations. Our policy requires that we notify law enforcement so they can be involved from the point of initial contact with the family. So our policy doesn't currently have the word immediately, but certainly we could incorporate that. But that's what's different about that phrase, is the word immediately is not currently in DCF policy, if that makes sense. The second piece around this is the language of the jurisdiction. To law enforcement, notice where the child resides or where the incident occurred. DCF current policy is that we do both. We do notify law enforcement where the child is known or described to reside, as well as describe where the incident occurred. So DCF does currently include both in our policy. The last piece is the information that uses the word sharing resources. And we're not quite sure what resources mean. We think we understand the spirit of the word resources, information. And certainly DCF is required to freely exchange with law enforcement already. So we would hope that would be happening, but we're not quite sure what the word resources means. So I think that influences our neutral testimony, but we do share information, and to the extent that the spirit of this is to just reinforce that information as a resource is shared, that already does occur. That summarizes the 3 changes, and I'm happy to answer any questions for clarity.
Thank you. Committee, are there any questions for Tanya? I see Senator Holscher has her hand up.
I'm going to talk.
Go ahead, Senator Holscher.
Thank you. Tanya, thank you for your testimony. So it sounds like pretty much you're doing what is being asked in this through the spirit of this bill in terms of communication. And then as far as the current wording, there's, concerns in terms of what could be potential volume as per Ed's testimony. So I'm just curious, is there a specific case that this is the result of, where something didn't happen in a time frame, or what's basically necessitating this bill, or do we know?
I do not know how this bill came to be. Certainly I know the sponsor Senator Shane. But beyond that, I do not have any insights into what has inspired this bill.
Thank you.
Committee, additional questions for Tanya?
Senator
Yes,
Kosich, Dr. Clifford, I have my
Yes.
hand up.
Yes, Senator Clifford.
Thank you. I agree with Senator Holscher. I haven't reached out to Senator Shane, but it's always difficult to deal with a bill which has no proponents. So I don't know if there is doesn't seem like there's a problem that we're trying to solve. Thank you.
Thank you. Additional questions for Tanya?
This is Senator Petty.
Yes, Senator Petty.
Thank you. So, Tanya, I'm glad you mentioned that phrase, shares resources, because as I looked at the bill, I wondered about that too. Do you have any thoughts on that? Do you think that's unnecessary because it's already occurring? And is that reflected otherwise in the current bill?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Senator, for the question. That there is information, there is current statute on line 36 of page 1 does set forth that there be a free exchange of information. It's possible that the word resources is duplicative. It's possible that it simply wishes to reinforce that to the extent that information is not enough to capture all resources, such as perhaps something else. I don't know. It could be duplicative without understanding the spirit, or perhaps something that has inspired the idea to have the word resource. I'm not sure I'm the best to answer that question.
Oh, okay. Thank you. But could it imply that you would have to allow your employees to be dictated by law enforcement?
Thank you for the question. I think there could be multiple interpretations of the word resource. And certainly in our fiscal impact, we made an assumption that the word resource did not mean human resources or any need for additional personnel from DCF to assist law enforcement. So we have made an assumption it does not mean human resources, but there certainly could be an interpretation that it might include human resources. Yes.
And just as a follow-up, you heard Ed Klump mention some potential amendments that he's going to be offering on this bill. And so I know you haven't seen them, or DCS has not seen them. But from the information, can you?
Senator Petty, your microphone was skipping out. You may want to repeat what you just said.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me now? Can you?
Yes.
Okay, so you had Klump, his suggestions that he's working on for amendments, and I was just wondering if you could respond from the DCS perspective on what he's suggesting.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Senator, for the question. I believe DCF had a preview of information, or a concept of information. I have not looked at the exact sentence structure. My understanding is that language would be added, that DCF would provide notice if there was reason to believe a crime had occurred. And again, I don't know that that's the exact language. I look forward to seeing the exact language. Without knowing the final sentence structure, one worry DCF might have, or input we might have, is, DCF isn't typically a decision maker on a threshold of whether or not a crime is alleged to have occurred. And if we were to integrate into that threshold into our decision making, that would be new. We don't have the expertise into defining alleged criminal behavior. Our current threshold, if you will, to assign for a joint investigation is in current law, and it begins on line 32 of page 1, in that there is serious physical harm to, serious deterioration of, or sexual abuse of child, and action may be required to protect the child. That is the current statutory threshold, and it is also in our policy in how a decision is made on whether or not to assign for a joint investigation. If it's described, and again, would look forward to seeing the final language, that a decision point would also be if a crime is alleged to have occurred. That's a different threshold for DCF to make a decision, that we historically do not have expertise in knowing whether or not a crime is alleged to have occurred.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. And Tanya, that then brings the question. We heard Carrie Leonard say, and I've heard others say, there should be better communication, and which is, I believe, why this bill was brought. Do you see that there could potentially be a lack of communication between law enforcement, or do you feel like the communication is adequate between the two departments?
Thank you, Madam Chair. We are aware of some worries and have received some information through reports from the Division of Child Advocate, and certainly locally, relationships are built and improved and want to continue to make sure that communication happens. I feel that there's adequate statutory pieces and policy requiring and encouraging communication. DCF has recently been holding community conversations with law enforcement around some other initiatives, such as 4 questions and some pieces. We want the communication to be robust and immediate and helpful and relevant. And I know that all of our service centers and regional directors really appreciate all of the law enforcement collaborators and partners. So it's there are parts where it could be a work in progress, but certainly I feel that the expectation has been set that communication be robust, swift, and relevant with law enforcement whenever that is needed.
Thank you, committee. Are there any additional questions for any of the conferees? Okay, not hearing or seeing any. This closes the hearing on Senate Bill 145. Late yesterday, we were given the ability
Senator
to.
Clifford just raised his hand.
I'm sorry, who?
Senator Clifford.
Okay, Senator Clifford.
Sorry, I'll defer for now. I just want to make some points of order before we close, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Points of order regarding this Senate Bill 145?
Nope.
Because we've closed that hearing.
Just general comments. I'll wait till you finish.
General comments regarding committee. I wanted to make sure that you understood that I closed the hearing on Senate Bill 145.
I absolutely understand.
Okay, thank you. We did receive notice that if we had a quorum, we could go ahead and work bills today. And committee, I would like to take final action on the 2 bills that we heard yesterday. And we will begin with Senate Bill 82.
Chair.
Yes.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I would like
to object to that, just because as of yesterday, we were told, no, we were not going to be working bills, that we could not. And not being in my office, I don't have my resources that I would have had with me otherwise. So I really am objecting to that.
And I received that because we're on such a tight time frame, and I felt like those 2 bills would be one that really we didn't have any controversy over or whatever, that's something that we could do during this. But if you feel uncomfortable or don't feel like you have the resources. I would not want to put anybody in a position to feel that way.
Madam Chair, this is Chase Blasey.
Yes,
I think the
Senator Blasey.
I think the biggest concern regarding taking action remotely is just ensuring we meet all the procedural requirements for COMA. And so I was advised that we do not take action remotely.
Oh,
Yeah, thank you.
okay.
I was concerned about that myself and wondering where that direction came from, because that would be a significant deviation from norm.
That direction came from the Senate President's office.
Wow, very interesting. That is certainly new to me, but I will defer to the discretion of the committee chairwoman.
So I appreciate that, Senator Blasey. Again, I don't think these are going to take very long. I can move them to later in the week. Okay, but I was just given the go ahead that we could do it, but I don't want anyone to feel uncomfortable about that. So we will adjourn this meeting. Thank you all for being on today.